Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as Michelle Carter adjusted her glasses, the thin frame catching a slight glint from the office's tired overhead lights. Her desk was cluttered with paperwork, an endless sea of spreadsheets, reports, and notes, each pile more demanding than the last. Outside the small corner office window, the Chicago skyline was muted, the lights of the city not quite bright enough to break through the misty gray of an early evening in December. It was the kind of day where the world seemed to be on pause, the clouds hanging low enough to swallow the horizon whole. Inside, it felt the same. The office around her was buzzing with the sounds of her colleagues winding down, the last phone calls of the day echoing off the walls. Their voices, carefree and loud, filled the space like a familiar hum, one that had grown too comfortable over the years. They were happy to be leaving for the day, but they weren't in a rush. Why would they be? They didn't have to carry the weight of everything she did. Her eyes flicked to her inbox once more. An email from Dave, the department's golden boy, pinged at the top of the list. Another one of his success stories. This time, it was about the presentation he just delivered to the board. A meeting Michelle had worked tirelessly behind the scenes for, preparing, organizing, gathering the data, making sure everything ran smoothly. The email was brief. Another win for the team. Great job, everyone. A simple acknowledgement, but one that always felt too hollow to Michelle. She exhaled slowly, her fingers hovering above the keyboard. She didn't need the praise, or at least that's what she told herself every time. Dave could take the credit, get the glory, and bask in the attention. That was his role. She had hers. It was all about being the quiet support, the unassuming figure behind the scenes. But today, for some reason, it didn't feel right. The noise in the office became more distant as she leaned back in her chair, the creaking of the wood beneath her quiet. She looked down at her hands, worn from years of typing, from the constant grind of working long hours. Her nails were neatly trimmed. No polish, no frills. Just another thing that kept her grounded in this life that didn't ask for attention. A quick glance across the room revealed Dave standing by the coffee machine, surrounded by a group of junior employees, all nodding as he spoke, each of them hanging on his every word. He was a natural leader, charismatic, the kind of person people couldn't help but follow. He had the looks, the charm, and the title to back it all up. It made sense, right? He was the one in charge. He was the one people noticed. And Michelle, well, she was just the assistant manager. The one who cleaned up after everyone else's messes, kept the engine running in the background while the others took the spotlight. And yet, she was the one who made it all work. Without Michelle's organization, Dave's success would have been impossible. The late nights, the rushed meetings, the endless revisions, all of it had her fingerprints on it. She had been the one to make sure the deadlines were met, the data was correct, and the presentation flowed smoothly. But none of that mattered. Dave had the title. Dave had the recognition. Dave had the power. Her chest tightened as she heard his voice rise in laughter, the sound of it rubbing against her like sandpaper. A fleeting moment of frustration bubbled up in her chest, and her mind drifted to the endless hours she had poured into this company. She had sacrificed so much for this job. Her time, her energy, and often even her peace of mind. She could feel the familiar, hollow ache of resentment creeping up again, like it always did at the end of the day. Why did it always have to be this way? Michelle snapped herself out of her thoughts and quickly turned her attention back to the screen. There was still work to be done, after all. Still things that needed to be sorted, emails that needed to be sent, reports that needed her careful review. But it all felt like a blur now, her work a never-ending cycle of organizing, arranging, and rearranging. There was always more to do, always something else that needed her attention. She couldn't remember the last time she felt anything other than exhaustion. A muffled voice broke through the haze of her thoughts, and she turned slightly, trying to tune into the conversation happening across the room. It was Dave talking about his big win during the presentation. A few of his colleagues were nodding along, praising him for his quick thinking and leadership. A small smile crossed Michelle's lips, one that felt foreign and uncomfortable. She wasn't bitter, not really. At least she didn't think she was. She was just tired of being invisible. Michelle's gaze shifted back to the window, where the last vestiges of daylight were beginning to fade, replaced by the cold blue light of the evening. The city looked so far away, distant and untouchable. She felt that distance too, in a way. A small, unimportant figure in the vast machine of corporate success. She wasn't the one who made the decisions. She wasn't the one who stood in front of the board, presenting ideas and making deals. But wasn't she the one who made it all happen? Would anyone even know what it took to get to this point if she weren't here? Her phone buzzed with a new message, pulling her back to reality. It was from Tasha, her 16-year-old daughter. "How's your day going, Mom? Love you. Can we get takeout tonight?" Michelle smiled softly, the warmth of her daughter's words pushing back the cool edge of frustration. "Of course, sweetheart," she typed back quickly, her fingers moving instinctively across the screen. "What are you craving?" Her phone buzzed again, and she looked down, her thumb hovering above the screen as a familiar name popped up. Dave Morgan. "Hey, Michelle," his message read. "I'm going to need those reports by 9 a.m. tomorrow. Could you pull together the updated financials? Thanks." A sigh escaped her lips. It was always something. She hadn't even gotten a thank you for the last report she'd done. No acknowledgement of how much effort it took, how much time she sacrificed to make sure everything was perfect. She quickly typed out a response, keeping it professional. "Got it. I'll have them ready by morning." Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment longer, thoughts swirling around in her mind. Was this what she was meant to do forever? Be the quiet support, the one who worked in the background while others took the credit? No. Something in her stirred, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She wasn't meant to stay in the background. She wasn't meant to be invisible. A quiet resolve started to build within her, the spark of something stronger than the frustration that had been clouding her mind. She was more than this. She had always been more. Michelle stood up from her desk, her legs stiff from sitting too long. She grabbed her coat from the back of her chair and slipped it on, the cool fabric brushing against her skin. She glanced back at her desk, her eyes lingering on the piles of papers, the unfinished tasks. She had done enough, more than enough, but tonight she was done. As she walked towards the door, she turned off the lights and locked the office behind her. She could hear the hum of the city outside, the promise of something bigger and brighter just beyond the horizon. Tonight, something was different. Tonight, she was ready for change. Michelle wasn't one to complain, but as she sat at her desk the next morning, the weight of her thoughts felt heavier than ever. The office hummed with the usual early morning buzz, the shuffling of papers, the whir of coffee machines, the sound of keyboards tapping away in rhythmic patterns. Everyone was settled into their routines, already deep in their work. And once again, Michelle found herself in the background, managing the daily logistics that kept everything running smoothly. It wasn't that she minded the work. She excelled at it, in fact. The reports, the meetings, the endless emails, and coordination with other departments. It was a familiar rhythm, one she had mastered over the years. But lately, it felt as though she was fading into the background, unseen, unappreciated. She wasn't the one in the spotlight. That role was reserved for people like Dave. Dave Morgan was the kind of person who walked into a room and immediately commanded attention. Tall, confident, with a smile that could charm even the most guarded executive. It wasn't just his looks either, though they certainly didn't hurt. It was his ability to make everything look effortless, to glide from one task to the next, making it seem like he had the world at his feet. Everyone loved Dave. He had the swagger, the charm, and the authority that made people want to follow him. And Michelle, well, she was the one who made sure his presentations were flawless, that his reports were up to date, that every detail was perfect. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. A text from Dave. "Hey, Michelle, can you get those updated reports to me by noon? I need them for the meeting later." Michelle sighed, her fingers hovering over the screen for a moment before typing back, "Sure, I'll have them ready." Another task, another responsibility she would carry on her shoulders. But it was fine. This was what she did. She was the reliable one, the one who made sure things ran without a hitch. But as the hours ticked by, the resentment grew, quietly, steadily, like a slow burn in her chest. She was always the one in the shadows, the one who made everything work without ever being seen. As the morning wore on, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped. Trapped in a role that everyone else was content to define for her. Trapped in a life where her contributions were undervalued, overlooked. Her work ethic, her skills, her knowledge. None of it seemed to matter. What mattered was the title, the recognition, the ability to stand at the front of the room while others applauded. She glanced over at Dave, who was deep in conversation with a few of the junior staff members by the coffee machine. They were laughing at something he'd said, their eyes glued to him as if he were the only person in the room. And why wouldn't they be? He had the position, the power, the respect. Michelle, on the other hand, was just the assistant manager. She had no title to speak of, no recognition beyond the tasks she handled behind the scenes. But something inside her stirred as she watched them. Something that hadn't been there before. A quiet realization, deep within her core. She was more than this. She had always been more than this. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on her office door. It was Elaine, the office receptionist, who had been working here for just as long as Michelle. "Hey, Michelle," Elaine said, her voice warm and friendly as she stuck her head inside the door. "I just wanted to let you know that the team is meeting in the conference room for a brainstorming session. Dave's leading it. Are you going to join?" Michelle hesitated, her gaze flicking over to the conference room down the hall. She knew what the meeting would be. Another opportunity for Dave to shine. Another chance for him to take center stage while she quietly worked in the background. "I think I'll sit this one out," Michelle said, forcing a smile. "I've got a few things to finish up." Elaine gave her a sympathetic look. "You should join, you know. You've got a lot of great ideas. You could help make a real difference." Michelle nodded but didn't respond. She didn't need to be reminded that she had great ideas. It wasn't the ideas that were the problem. It was the lack of recognition, the constant underestimation of her value. She wasn't the one who spoke up in meetings, wasn't the one who fought for her place at the table. That was Dave. He had the confidence, the ability to demand attention, the fearlessness that Michelle had never been able to summon. As Elaine walked away, Michelle turned back to her desk, her thoughts clouded by the tension building within her. She wasn't content to simply fade into the background anymore. She was tired of being the quiet support, the one who did all the hard work without any acknowledgement. There had to be more to her than this. She had spent years keeping her head down, doing everything the right way, but it never seemed to be enough. Maybe it was time for a change. Maybe it was time for her to take charge, to stop letting others define her. The hours passed in a blur as she worked through the reports, each click of the mouse and tap of the keyboard feeling more like a chore than a task. She finished just before noon and sent the final report to Dave, her fingers still tingling from the weight of the frustration that had been building inside her. She had done everything asked of her, and yet, she felt as invisible as ever. At lunchtime, Michelle headed to the break room, hoping for a moment of peace. She grabbed a sandwich from the fridge and sat down at one of the small tables, her mind still reeling. Her colleagues chatted nearby, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing inside her. Michelle's phone buzzed once again, and she glanced at the screen. It was another message from Dave. "I need those updated figures for the quarterly review. Can you pull those by 3 p.m.? A surge of irritation washed over her, but she quickly tamped it down. She had to focus. She had to keep her head down. But deep inside, a quiet voice whispered, "Enough." As the afternoon wore on, Michelle found herself once again caught between the demands of her work and the growing desire to break free from the role she had been assigned. She had spent too many years being underestimated, too many years doing the work while others took the credit. She was tired of being the one who quietly kept everything running. She was tired of watching others take the glory, of watching Dave receive praise for something she had worked tirelessly to make happen. For the first time in a long while, Michelle began to imagine a different future. One where she didn't have to hide in the background. One where she didn't have to remain invisible. She had always been told she was too quiet, too humble, too willing to stay in the shadows. But maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe it was time for her to stop waiting for permission and start taking what was rightfully hers. The thought lingered in her mind as she worked, growing stronger with each passing minute. It was a small seed of defiance, but it was there, rooted deep within her. And as the workday wound down and the office slowly emptied out, Michelle couldn't help but wonder, what if she could take the lead? She wasn't just the secretary. She wasn't just the assistant. She wasn't just the one who made everything work. She was Michelle Carter, and she was done being invisible. The week dragged on, each day blending into the next. The same repetitive cycle of reports, meetings, and the quiet hum of the office. Yet something within Michelle had shifted. A fire had ignited, small at first but growing steadily, pushing her to see beyond the confines of her routine. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than just being the background worker, the one who was invisible to everyone else. But the question remained, how did she make that shift? How did she take charge when every door seemed closed? It came unexpectedly, like a spark in the dark. The email came through on Friday afternoon, a project announcement from the higher-ups. Michelle's eyes scanned the subject line, her heart skipping a beat. New high-profile project, team leads announced. She clicked on the message, curiosity tingling in her fingertips. The email detailed a high-stakes project that would determine the future of the department, with a potential promotion and financial bonuses attached for those who succeeded. Dave's name was listed as the lead. No surprise there. He was the natural choice, the charismatic leader, the face of the team. But something in Michelle stirred when she saw that name. It wasn't resentment anymore. It wasn't the familiar feeling of being overlooked. No, this was different. This was something new. Her mind raced, her thoughts sharpening with each passing moment. She had always been the quiet support. She had always worked behind the scenes. But what if she didn't have to? What if she could take this opportunity and turn the tables? The team was already set. Dave, of course. A few of the other senior managers, a couple of junior employees. It was the usual mix, the same faces she had seen over the years, all moving through the same motions. But there was one thing Michelle knew that they didn't. The project wasn't just about getting it done. It was about how it got done. As the days passed and the initial excitement over the project announcement began to fade, Michelle spent every waking moment thinking about it. She reviewed the materials, the project outline, and every detail she could find. She researched, gathered information, and began to formulate a plan. The project wasn't just about meeting expectations. It was about exceeding them. It was about making it impossible to ignore her contributions. On Monday morning, the team gathered in the conference room for the first official meeting. Michelle arrived early, as she always did, her mind already racing with ideas. Dave was there, of course, his usual confident demeanor in place. He greeted the others with his signature charm, but Michelle noticed the slight undercurrent of stress in his voice. He had been handed this project, yes, but he had no idea what lay ahead. He had no idea what Michelle was capable of. "All right, everyone," Dave began, his voice carrying across the room. "This is a big one. We need to nail this from the start. Let's make sure we're all on the same page. Michelle, you're going to handle the logistics like usual, right?" The word stung more than Michelle cared to admit. Like usual, as if that was all she was. Someone who handled logistics, someone who made sure the pieces fit together while the others took the credit. She nodded, keeping her face neutral. "Yes, I'll make sure everything is in order." But this time, she wasn't just going to handle the logistics. This time, she was going to take the reins. The next few days passed in a blur as Michelle buried herself in the project. She was meticulous, every detail, every number, every possibility. She knew that if she was going to prove herself, she needed to do more than just work hard. She needed to show them what she was capable of without asking for permission. She spent hours alone in the conference room, combing through data, refining the project strategy, and brainstorming ideas. At night, she would go home and continue her work, staying up late to perfect every aspect of the presentation, making sure everything was flawless. She didn't sleep much. She didn't need to. She was driven by something stronger now, something deeper than the need for recognition. This was about proving to herself that she was more than just the assistant. It wasn't long before Michelle realized that she was the one doing the heavy lifting. Dave would pop in now and then, offering vague suggestions and checking in on the progress, but it was Michelle who was doing the real work. It was Michelle who was organizing the team, keeping everything on track, and solving the problems that no one else seemed to notice. But the difference now was that she wasn't asking for validation. She didn't need anyone's approval. She was doing this for herself. One afternoon, as the team gathered in the conference room for another update meeting, Michelle felt a flicker of something unfamiliar: confidence. She had worked for years without asking for recognition, without stepping into the spotlight. But now, it felt like the spotlight was inching closer, as if it was her turn to step up. Dave stood at the front of the room, a few slides on the projector behind him. He was going through the motions, outlining the project's goals, assigning tasks. As usual, the team nodded along, agreeing with everything he said. Michelle watched from the back of the room, feeling the tension in her chest build. She had spent enough time in the background. She had spent enough time supporting others without acknowledgement. Now it was time to take control. When Dave asked for updates from the team, Michelle raised her hand. The room fell silent for a moment, the others glancing at her in surprise. Dave looked at her, raising an eyebrow. "Michelle, what's on your mind?" he asked, his tone casual, but there was an edge of curiosity in his voice. Michelle stood up, her palms slightly sweaty, but her voice steady. "I've been reviewing the budget breakdown," she said, her voice clear and firm, "and I think we can optimize some of the resource allocation. I've got a proposal for reallocating a portion of the budget toward marketing, which I believe will yield better results in the long term." The room was still for a moment. The others looked at each other, unsure of how to respond. Dave's expression faltered for just a split second before he smiled. His charming, rehearsed smile. "Interesting idea, Michelle," he said, though there was a note of condescension in his voice. "We'll take that under advisement." But Michelle wasn't finished. "Actually," she continued, "I've already put together a draft proposal with numbers and projections. I'll send it to everyone after the meeting." She turned and locked eyes with him for a brief moment, her heart racing. There was no going back now. The rest of the meeting continued, but Michelle's mind was already ahead. She didn't care what Dave thought of her proposal. She didn't care what anyone thought. She had done her part, and now it was time for everyone else to see it. When the meeting ended, she stayed behind, opening her laptop and pulling up the proposal she had spent hours perfecting. As the last of the team members left, she sent the proposal to Dave and the others, then sat back in her chair, the quiet weight of her decision settling over her. She had spoken up. She had taken the first step toward proving herself. It didn't matter that it was small. What mattered was that it was hers. It was the beginning of something bigger. And for the first time in a long while, Michelle Carter felt a sense of power, quiet but undeniable. The next few days felt like they passed in slow motion. The quiet, constant hum of the office, the clattering of keyboards, the endless rounds of meetings. It was all the same as it had always been. But for Michelle, it felt different now. There was an undercurrent of change within her. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't something that everyone could see, but she felt it, and that was enough. The team was deep in the planning phase of the project, working on logistics, finalizing budgets, and refining the marketing strategy. Dave, of course, was still leading the charge, but Michelle noticed something that had changed. The team was starting to turn to her more. They were starting to ask for her opinion, to seek her guidance, to value her input. It wasn't immediate, but it was there. Small gestures, small shifts. One morning, Dave entered the conference room with his usual swagger, his broad smile lighting up the space. He glanced at the team, then turned to Michelle with a brief nod. "Morning, Michelle," he said, his voice warm. "Got those updated budget figures?" Michelle glanced at him, noticing how his smile seemed to lack the usual self-assuredness. He was running through the motions, as if the weight of the project was beginning to settle on him. She could see the cracks forming beneath his polished surface, and the realization struck her. He didn't have it all together like everyone thought he did, and that made her own resolve grow stronger. "Right here," Michelle replied calmly, sliding the updated figures across the table toward him. "I also made a few adjustments to the marketing allocation just like I proposed last week. If you'd like, we can discuss it in more detail later." Dave's eyes lingered on the sheet, and for a moment, Michelle could see the flicker of hesitation. He scanned the numbers quickly, then looked up at her. "Looks good. We'll go over it later in the meeting," he said with a slight edge to his voice, as if trying to maintain control of the situation. Michelle noticed the subtle tightness in his jaw, the small signs that he was feeling the pressure, even if he was trying to hide it. But Michelle wasn't fazed. She didn't need to prove anything to him anymore. She knew she had the right answers, the right strategy. What she needed now was the chance to lead, to show everyone what she was capable of without waiting for permission. The meeting began with Dave at the head of the table, as usual. He went through the agenda, his voice confident, outlining the goals and timelines for the next few weeks. The team nodded along, listening intently. But as the meeting progressed, it became clear that Dave was faltering. His usual charisma was slipping, replaced by a sense of uncertainty. He stumbled over a few key points, his eyes darting to Michelle for reassurance. It was subtle, but it didn't go unnoticed. Michelle leaned forward in her chair, her fingers brushing against the smooth wood of the table as she prepared to speak. She had seen this moment coming, and she knew it was time to step up. "Actually, I think we need to revisit the marketing strategy," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I've been looking at the data again, and we're missing a key demographic. We need to shift some of our focus to a more targeted approach. If we stick with the current plan, we might not see the returns we're expecting." Dave hesitated, his gaze flicking to the others in the room. "Well, Michelle, we've already discussed this. I think we're good with the original plan." But Michelle wasn't backing down. She'd already done the work. She knew what she was talking about. "I understand," she replied, meeting his gaze. "But after looking at the numbers, I think this adjustment will give us a better chance at hitting our target. The new plan will allow us to allocate resources more effectively, reaching the right audience. I can show you the revised projections if you'd like." For a brief moment, there was silence in the room. The other team members glanced between Michelle and Dave, sensing the tension building. Dave's expression flickered, his confidence beginning to crack. "Fine," he said, his tone tight. "Show us the numbers, then." Michelle opened her laptop and pulled up the updated figures, projecting them onto the screen for the team to see. She went through each change step by step, explaining the rationale behind her decisions and how the new strategy would lead to better engagement and higher conversion rates. As she spoke, Michelle noticed the shift in the room. The team members were paying attention now. They were looking at her, not Dave. They were asking questions, nodding in agreement, offering their own insights. For the first time in this project, it felt like Michelle was the one in control. It was her plan that was taking shape, her strategy that was being embraced. Dave sat quietly, his arms crossed over his chest, a slight frown tugging at the corners of his mouth. He had been the leader, he was the one who was supposed to have all the answers. But now, in this moment, it was Michelle who held the power. She wasn't just the support anymore. She was the one leading the conversation. When the meeting ended, there was a noticeable shift in the dynamic. People lingered for a moment, chatting with Michelle about the changes she had proposed. They were asking her questions, seeking her expertise. Dave, on the other hand, was left standing at the front of the room, trying to regain his composure. His authority was no longer as unquestioned as it had been just days ago. Michelle walked out of the conference room, her heart pounding in her chest, but not from fear. No, this was something different. This was the feeling of taking control, of stepping into a role that had always seemed out of reach. She wasn't just the one who made sure everything ran smoothly anymore. She was the one calling the shots. And for the first time, she realized that the team respected her for it. The next few days were a blur of activity. The team moved forward with Michelle's revised strategy, and the results were immediately apparent. Engagement numbers began to rise, and the marketing campaign started to pick up steam. It wasn't just that the new plan was working, it was that Michelle was the one who had made it happen. And she wasn't afraid to take credit for it. She could see the shift in how people looked at her. The whispers were no longer about Dave. They were about Michelle. Her ideas were gaining traction, her leadership was being acknowledged, and the respect that had always eluded her was finally becoming tangible. It wasn't easy, though. Every step forward seemed to come with new challenges. Dave, despite the outward show of compliance, still resisted. He still tried to maintain the illusion of control, subtly undermining Michelle's authority when he thought no one was looking. But Michelle was smarter now. She knew how to navigate the politics of the office, how to play the game without letting him have the final say. She had the numbers on her side, and that made all the difference. One afternoon, Dave pulled her aside in the hallway, his expression guarded. "Michelle, I'm not sure about some of the changes you made. I think we need to go back to the original plan," he said quietly. Michelle looked at him, her eyes calm and steady. "The numbers speak for themselves, Dave. I'm not suggesting anything that isn't in the best interest of the project. We're on track, and that's all that matters." He looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to read her, trying to find the flaw in her confidence. But there was none. Michelle had taken the lead, and she wasn't about to hand it back. "I'll stick to my plan," she said, her voice firm. "You can either support it or you can continue doing what we've always done. But the results will speak for themselves." Dave's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. Michelle turned and walked away, her heart racing. But this time, it wasn't out of fear. This time, it was because she knew. She had taken control of her own destiny, and there was no turning back. The following week felt like the calm before the storm. Michelle had successfully navigated the project through its early hurdles, and her confidence was only growing. The team was following her lead, and results were starting to speak for themselves. She felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders, but it didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like a calling. However, even as her influence in the project grew, she could feel the tension slowly building in the background, like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. Dave, despite his outward acceptance of her role in the project, was beginning to grow resentful. His charm had begun to wear thin, and Michelle could see it in the way he spoke to her. More curtly, more dismissive. He no longer treated her as a colleague, as an equal. Instead, he seemed to be testing her patience, constantly undermining her authority in subtle ways. It was a Thursday afternoon when it all came to a head. The team gathered for the weekly status meeting, and Michelle could feel the air in the room shift as soon as Dave walked in. He was late, as usual, but there was a new tension in his step. His smile was gone, replaced by a hard set to his jaw. He glanced briefly at Michelle before turning his attention to the rest of the team, taking his usual position at the head of the table. Michelle, who had already set up the agenda, didn't flinch. She had earned her place here. She was no longer the background worker. She was part of this team, and she was going to make sure everyone knew it. "All right," Dave said, his voice a little too sharp. "Let's get started. We'll go over the metrics, then discuss any issues." He glanced at Michelle, as if to remind her that he was still in charge. "Michelle, I assume you've got the latest numbers for us?" Michelle nodded and opened her laptop, pulling up the projected growth numbers. "Yes, I've revised the forecast based on the latest data," she said calmly, projecting the numbers onto the screen for everyone to see. "We're on track to exceed our initial goals, especially with the new marketing strategy." As the team began to review the figures, Michelle could feel Dave's gaze on her. It wasn't one of admiration or respect, but one of quiet scrutiny. He was watching her closely, as if waiting for her to slip up, to make a mistake. And though she didn't show it, she could feel the pressure mounting. She had earned her place in the spotlight, but that didn't mean it was easy to keep. After a few moments of silence, Dave cleared his throat. "I've been looking at the numbers," he said, his voice steady but laced with a hint of skepticism. "I think we might need to rethink some of your marketing allocations, Michelle." We're overspending in certain areas, and I'm not sure if it's the best use of resources." Michelle felt a flare of irritation but held it in check. She had already considered all the projections and had already accounted for every potential discrepancy. She knew the numbers inside and out, and she wasn't about to let Dave undermine her so easily. "I disagree," she replied, her voice firm but controlled. "The allocation is in line with industry trends, and the projections are based on solid data. If we scale back now, we'll lose momentum. It's a calculated risk, but it's one that will pay off." Dave's smile was tight, forced. "I'm just trying to make sure we don't waste resources. We need to be smarter about this." "I understand," Michelle replied, her eyes meeting him directly. "But cutting the budget now would mean we risk missing our targets. I've done the analysis. The budget allocation is sound." For a moment, the room was silent. The rest of the team was watching, but no one spoke. They could feel the tension between Dave and Michelle, the unspoken competition, the battle for control. It wasn't just about the project anymore. It was about something deeper. About who was truly in charge, who had the vision, who had the authority. Dave cleared his throat again, but his voice had lost some of its initial confidence. "All right, Michelle, let's see how things go. But we'll revisit this in next week's meeting." Michelle didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded, but the weight of Dave's challenge hung in the air. It was clear to her now, he was testing her, trying to make her doubt her decisions, trying to regain some control over the project he had once thought was his. The meeting continued, but Michelle's mind was elsewhere, her thoughts racing. Dave's resistance had become more than just an inconvenience. It was a power struggle, one that was escalating with every interaction. She knew that it was only a matter of time before she would have to confront him directly. She couldn't keep allowing him to undermine her authority without challenging him. But for now, she kept her focus on the task at hand, knowing that the project was thriving and that her leadership was becoming more apparent with each passing day. The following week, Michelle noticed something even more unsettling. Dave was distancing himself from the team, delegating tasks without much input, his interactions with the group becoming more transactional. He wasn't as engaged as he had been, and it seemed like he was retreating into himself, unwilling to take responsibility for anything that went wrong. Michelle, on the other hand, was stepping up more than ever. She was in constant communication with the team, offering guidance and support where it was needed. She reviewed the marketing plans, coordinated with the data team, and made sure the projections were on track. She wasn't just participating in the project anymore. She was leading it. The tension in the office continued to rise as the days went on. Michelle knew that it couldn't stay this way for long. Something had to give. Then, the tipping point came during a team lunch meeting, where the project's final presentation was being discussed. Dave had decided, once again, to challenge Michelle's decisions. "I don't think we should go with your approach for the final presentation," he said, his tone more dismissive than before. "I think we need a stronger focus on the numbers. People don't care about the narrative. They care about results." Michelle was taken aback by the sudden change in his attitude. He had always been supportive of her ideas before, but now he was undermining everything she had worked for. She looked around the table and the team was silent. They could feel the tension in the room. It wasn't just about the presentation anymore. It was about control. "No, Dave," Michelle said, her voice steady. "The numbers matter, yes, but so does the story. This presentation is about showing our progress and the impact this project will have on the company. We need both strong numbers and a compelling narrative. That's what will make the board take notice." For a moment, the room was still. Dave's eyes narrowed as he looked at her, but Michelle didn't back down. She had earned her place at the table, and she wasn't going to let him take it away. After a long pause, Dave sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. "All right, Michelle, you're the one in charge here," he said, his voice almost begrudging. "But we'll see how it goes." As the meeting ended, Michelle couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet victory. She had stood her ground. She had made it clear that she wasn't going to let Dave, or anyone, undermine her authority. The project was hers now, and she was going to see it through to the end. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity as the project moved toward its final stages. Michelle worked tirelessly, making sure every detail was in place, every number was accurate, and every narrative point was compelling. Her confidence had only grown, and the team followed her lead without question. Dave, meanwhile, remained distant, retreating further into the background. But Michelle didn't mind. She didn't need Dave's approval anymore. The project was thriving under her leadership, and the results spoke for themselves. There was no turning back now. The power had shifted, and it was hers to claim. Michelle's heart pounded as the final stages of the project approached. Everything had been building up to this moment. The countless late nights, the stress, the quiet victories, it was all coming to a head. She had stepped into a role she never thought possible, but now she was leading this team, and there was no going back. As the days wore on, the tension between her and Dave continued to simmer beneath the surface. His resentment was impossible to ignore, but Michelle had learned to navigate his subtle attempts to regain control. She didn't need his approval anymore. She didn't need anyone's approval. The work was speaking for itself, and her team was starting to look to her as the real leader. But there was still one thing that had been nagging her, something she couldn't shake. Dave had never been a truly hands-on leader. He was more about appearances than substance, about taking credit without doing the heavy lifting. He had always been the charming, smooth-talking figure at the front of the room. But Michelle had realized something about him, something she had known for a while but hadn't fully understood until now. He didn't care about the project. Not really. He cared about the recognition, the accolades, and the title. The success of the project itself was secondary to his desire to keep control, to be seen as the one in charge. Michelle had seen through it all, and for the first time, she realized that she wasn't going to let him continue this charade. It all came to a head one afternoon, a week before the final presentation to the board. The team had gathered in the conference room for one last review, and Michelle was prepared. She had spent hours refining the presentation, double-checking the numbers, and ensuring that everything was in place. She was confident, almost too confident, and as she entered the room, she could feel the weight of the moment settling in. Dave was already there, of course, sitting at the head of the table. He greeted Michelle with his usual smile, but she could see the tension in his eyes. He had been avoiding the details of the project more and more in recent days, delegating the work to others while trying to maintain his position as the figurehead. But Michelle knew the truth. She knew who had carried this project from the beginning, and she wasn't going to let him steal the credit now. "All right, everyone," Dave began, his voice a little too loud, a little too rehearsed. "Let's go over the final details. We need to make sure everything is perfect for the presentation. Michelle, I trust you've got the last-minute revisions covered." Michelle took a deep breath and glanced at the team. They were all waiting for her, silently, as if they were expecting her to take control. And for the first time, she realized just how far she had come. She wasn't just the one behind the scenes anymore. She wasn't just the assistant manager, quietly fixing the mistakes and keeping things running. She was the leader now. It was her project, her vision, and she was going to see it through to the end. "I've got everything," she said, her voice steady, almost calm. "But before we move forward, I need to make a few changes to the final presentation. I've been thinking about the structure, and I believe it could be more impactful if we shift the focus a bit." Dave's smile faltered slightly. "What changes?" he asked, his tone slightly defensive. "I've been looking at the data, and I think we can present the marketing projections in a more compelling way," Michelle said, her voice gaining strength. "If we adjust the flow of the presentation and start with the key results, it'll draw the board's attention immediately. We can highlight the growth potential and then dive into the details." Dave didn't respond immediately. He just stared at her, his eyes narrowing as he processed her words. There was a brief moment of silence in the room, and Michelle could feel the eyes of the team on her. They were waiting for her to take charge. They had already seen what she could do, and they trusted her. The only one who was still questioning her decisions was Dave. And Michelle wasn't going to let him stand in her way anymore. "I don't think that's necessary," Dave said, his voice tight. We've already gone over the presentation structure. It's fine the way it is. But Michelle wasn't backing down. It's not fine, she said firmly, meeting his gaze. I've been over every detail, Dave. I've done the analysis. This will make the presentation stronger. We need to make sure the board sees how this project will impact the company long-term. For a moment, it seemed like Dave was going to argue again, but then something in his face shifted. He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for what was coming next. I'm the project lead, Michelle, he said, his voice low and controlled. And I don't appreciate you questioning my decisions in front of the team. There it was, the challenge, the subtle attempt to remind her of her place. But Michelle wasn't going to let him undermine her. Not anymore. She had earned her position, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it from her. You might be the project lead, Dave, Michelle said, her voice calm but filled with an unwavering resolve. But this project was built on my work, my vision, and my strategy. And I'm not going to let you hijack it now. There was a long pause in the room. The rest of the team was watching, their eyes flicking between Michelle and Dave, sensing the tension rising. Dave's face flushed with frustration, his mouth tightening into a thin line. He opened his mouth to speak again, but Michelle was done. She wasn't going to wait for his approval anymore. This is my presentation, Dave, Michelle continued, her voice ringing with quiet authority. And if you want to lead, you'll have to start trusting me and the team to get this right. For the first time in this project, Dave looked unsure. The room was still, the weight of Michelle's words hanging in the air like a heavy silence. He glanced at the team, who were all waiting for him to respond. But he didn't. He couldn't. The power had shifted, and he knew it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dave let out a slow breath and sat back in his chair, his posture stiff and defeated. Fine, he muttered, his tone bitter. Do it your way. Let's just get this over with. Michelle didn't say anything more. She simply nodded, as if this had been the outcome she had expected all along. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction. She had simply claimed what was hers. As the team continued to review the final presentation, Michelle felt a wave of calm wash over her. The storm had passed. She had stood her ground, and now there was no turning back. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Michelle oversaw the final revisions to the presentation, ensuring that every detail was perfect, every number was accurate, and every narrative point was compelling. She worked closely with the team, offering guidance and support, making sure they were all on the same page. Dave, meanwhile, continued to distance himself from the work, leaving Michelle to carry the load. By the time the day of the presentation arrived, Michelle was ready. The nerves she had once felt were gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that had settled deep within her. This was her moment, and she wasn't going to let anything or anyone stand in her way. The boardroom was filled with the usual buzz of anticipation, the hum of conversations and the sound of papers shuffling. Dave stood at the front, nervously adjusting his suit, while Michelle stood quietly at the side, waiting for her turn. She could feel the eyes of the board members on her, but she didn't flinch. She knew the numbers, she knew the story, and now she was ready to tell me. When it was time to begin, Dave introduced the project as expected. He went through the slides, outlining the basics of the campaign, the progress they had made, and the expected outcomes. But when he handed the presentation over to Michelle for the final section, everything changed. Michelle stepped forward, the room falling silent as she took control. She presented the revised strategy, the new marketing allocations, and the projected growth. She spoke confidently, her words clear and compelling. She made the board see the potential of the project, the long-term impact it could have on the company. And as she spoke, she could see the board members leaning in, nodding in agreement, their attention completely focused on her. When the presentation ended, there was a moment of silence. Then, slowly, the board members began to clap. The applause was warm, genuine, and Michelle felt a sense of quiet satisfaction wash over her. She had done it. She had taken control, and she had succeeded. The week after the presentation felt like a strange mixture of relief and excitement. Michelle had walked into that boardroom with nothing but her data, her ideas, and her resolve. And by the end of it, she had won them over. The board members, who had once looked at her as just a behind-the-scenes organizer, were now calling her the project's true leader. The approval had come quicker than she'd expected, and the validation was both overwhelming and incredibly satisfying. But amidst all of that, there was still a lingering tension between Michelle and Dave. While the board had praised her efforts, Dave's reaction had been far from enthusiastic. He had congratulated her, of course, but the look in his eyes told a different story. There was no genuine warmth, no recognition of the hard work she had put into the project. Instead, there was only thinly veiled resentment and a quiet frustration that bubbled beneath the surface. As the days went on, the shift in power became more and more apparent. The team had rallied behind Michelle, fully recognizing that she had been the driving force behind the project's success. Her decisions had led them to exceed their targets, and her leadership had pulled them all together when things seemed to be falling apart. She wasn't just another manager anymore. She was the one who had turned the tide, who had made things happen. And it wasn't just the team that saw it. Others in the company began to take notice too. Michelle had always known that change wasn't going to come easy. She had worked for years in the background, silently doing the work, never asking for attention, never stepping forward. But now that is all starting to change. And though she welcomed the newfound recognition, there was a part of her that felt uncomfortable with the spotlight. It wasn't that she didn't deserve it. She did. But it was new territory, and the unfamiliarity made her uneasy. It was Friday afternoon when everything finally came to a head. The company's leadership team had called a meeting to discuss the outcome of the project, and Michelle had been asked to present the results. This was her moment. This was the moment where she could cement her place as a leader, as someone who could take on any challenge and deliver. She sat at her desk in the corner office, her mind running through the numbers and the narrative she had crafted. She had already spent hours preparing, refining every detail. She wanted to make sure this meeting went perfectly. She couldn't afford to let anything slip now. Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was a message from Dave. "You'll do great today. Just keep it simple and stay focused on the numbers." Michelle couldn't help but feel a slight pang of irritation. The words sounded like something you'd say to someone who didn't know what they were doing. It was the kind of advice that didn't carry the weight of respect, just a reminder that she was still considered an outsider, still someone who had only recently earned her place. But she didn't dwell on it. Instead, she took a deep breath and closed her eyes for a moment. She had worked too hard, fought too long to let anyone, least of all Dave, distract her now. The meeting room was packed when Michelle arrived, the leadership team sitting around the table in their usual positions. The air was thick with anticipation. The project's success had been the talk of the company for days, and everyone wanted to see how Michelle would present the results. She had already gone over the details with the project team, but this was different. This was her moment to shine. As she stepped into the room, the chatter died down, and all eyes turned to her. She took her place at the front, standing confidently in front of the projector. Her slides were ready, the presentation polished and rehearsed. She glanced around the room, making eye contact with the team leaders, the senior executives. They all looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and respect. They hadn't expected this from her. No one had. But Michelle was done with hiding. She was done being the invisible worker, the one who made everything happen without anyone noticing. She was here now, and she wasn't going to shy away from the spotlight. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I'm here to present the results of our project, the one that we've been working on for the last few months. I'm proud to say that not only did we exceed our initial targets, but we also hit a number of new benchmarks that will help position the company for long-term success." As she moved through the presentation, outlining the data, the successes, and the lessons learned, Michelle couldn't help but notice the shift in the room. The leadership team was hanging on her every word. They were listening to her. They were respecting her. The shift that had started in the boardroom was now taking hold, and it felt empowering. It was as if all those years of working in the shadows had finally led to this moment, this recognition that she had earned. She wasn't just part of the team anymore. She was the leader. Dave sat at the back of the room, his arms crossed over his chest. He had been silent throughout the meeting, letting Michelle do all the talking. His usual confidence was nowhere to be found. He had ceded control, and now it was clear Michelle was the one in charge. As the meeting drew to a close, Michelle finished her presentation with a simple statement. This project was a success because of the hard work and dedication of everyone here. I'm proud to be part of this team, and I'm looking forward to what we can accomplish next. There was a beat of silence before the room erupted into applause. For the first time, it wasn't just polite clapping. It was genuine recognition, a recognition that Michelle had earned with every late night, every painstaking detail, and every decision she had made. When the applause died down, one of the senior executives, Michael, stood up. "Michelle," he said, his voice loud and clear, "I just want to say that you've done a phenomenal job leading this project. Your work has been exemplary, and I think it's clear to everyone in this room that you've earned the respect of the entire team." Michelle felt a warmth spread through her chest, but she kept her expression composed. She wasn't going to get swept away by the praise. She had worked for this. She had fought for it, and now it was hers. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. "But this was a team effort. I couldn't have done it without the support of everyone in this room." As the meeting ended and people filtered out, Michelle found herself standing alone in the conference room for a moment. The applause still echoed in her ears, the recognition still fresh in her mind. But she wasn't thinking about the applause. She wasn't thinking about the praise. She was thinking about how far she had come, about the quiet strength that had carried her from the background to the forefront. She had earned this, not because she had sought it, but because she had worked for it every single day. When Dave walked out of the room, his face was tight, his shoulders stiff. He didn't say anything to Michelle, didn't congratulate her. He simply walked past her, his eyes avoiding hers, and that was fine. He didn't need to say anything. The team had spoken, and they had spoken loudly. Michelle had taken the spotlight, and there was no going back. In the days that followed, the recognition kept coming. More meetings, more praise, more acknowledgement of her leadership. It wasn't about the accolades anymore. It was about respect. The respect she had earned not through flashy gestures or dramatic speeches, but through quiet, consistent work and the willingness to step into the unknown. She had risen from the shadows, from the role of the invisible worker, to become the leader of the project. And she wasn't done yet. The spotlight was hers now. The days following the successful presentation passed in a blur of congratulations, handshakes, and the steady hum of corporate life continuing around Michelle. The company had officially recognized her work, and the project was hailed as a resounding success. People began to stop by her office to offer their thanks and praise, even the executives who had once looked past her, now eager to make their gratitude known. But Michelle didn't linger on the applause. She was used to working in the shadows, used to being overlooked. This newfound recognition, while deeply satisfying, didn't change who she was or how she viewed herself. It was the work that mattered to her, not the accolades. The satisfaction of a job well done, of knowing that she had made a real difference, was enough. Still, it was impossible to ignore the shift that had taken place. Her colleagues treated her differently now. People who had once brushed her off or belittled her were now seeking her advice, asking for her input, respecting her authority. It wasn't just about the project anymore. It was about Michelle's quiet power, the way she had stepped up and taken charge when the opportunity arose. Dave, on the other hand, had retreated further into the background. His role as project lead had been rendered meaningless in the face of Michelle's leadership. The board had recognized her as the true architect of the project's success, and even the higher-ups had started to take notice. Dave had no choice but to accept that he had been outshined, and the bitterness in his eyes every time he looked at Michelle was palpable. He had been the face of the project, but Michelle had been the heart and soul of it. The shift was undeniable, and it was something Dave couldn't ignore. It was a Friday afternoon when Michelle was called into the CEO's office for a private meeting. The request came as a surprise. She had expected to spend the remainder of the week catching up on the piles of work that had accumulated during the project. But as she walked into the sleek, modern office of the CEO, her mind raced with questions. "Michelle, come in," the CEO, Linda, said warmly, standing up from behind her desk. "I've been meaning to speak with you." Michelle took a seat, her heart still beating a little faster than usual. She had spent years in this company, but she had never been called into Linda's office for anything other than routine business. Today felt different, and Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. "You did an incredible job on the project," Linda said, smiling as she folded her hands on the desk. "The results speak for themselves, but what impressed me most was your leadership. You took charge when it mattered, and you did it with grace and confidence. That's not something you see every day." Michelle's breath caught in her throat. She had always admired Linda, respected her as the ultimate authority in the company. To hear those words from her was overwhelming in the best way possible. But she didn't let herself get lost in the praise. She had worked hard for this moment, and now it was time to see where it would lead. "Thank you," Michelle said, her voice steady. "I'm proud of what we accomplished, but it was a team effort. Everyone played a part." Linda nodded, her expression serious. "Of course, but you were the one who made it all happen. You brought the team together, you guided them through the challenges, and you delivered results. That's leadership." Michelle shifted slightly in her seat, the weight of Linda's words settling on her shoulders. It was one thing to hear praise from colleagues, from peers, but to hear it from someone like Linda, it was a different level of validation. She had earned this, not through loud gestures or self-promotion, but through quiet determination and a willingness to do the work. "I'd like to offer you something," Linda continued, leaning forward. "We're planning a major expansion in the next quarter, and I think you're the right person to lead it." Michelle's heart skipped a beat. The words she had dreamed of hearing for so long were finally here. She had worked for this moment, but hearing it spoken out loud made everything feel so real. "Lead the expansion?" Michelle asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Linda smiled. "Yes, I want you to take charge of the next phase. You've proven yourself, Michelle. You've shown that you can take on the responsibility, and I trust you to make it happen." Michelle felt the weight of the moment. This was the opportunity she had always wanted, the chance to prove to herself and to the world that she was more than just a behind-the-scenes worker. She was a leader, and now the company has finally recognized that. "I won't let you down," Michelle said, her voice filled with quiet determination. Linda smiled, her eyes twinkling with approval. "I know you won't. You've earned this, Michelle. Now it's time to take the next step." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity as Michelle stepped into her new role. The expansion project was massive, and Michelle threw herself into it with the same level of focus and dedication that she had brought to the previous project. But this time, there was no one to undermine her. No one questions her decisions. She was in charge now, and the team responded to her leadership with respect and admiration. The early days of the project were filled with the usual challenges: balancing budgets, coordinating teams, managing resources. But Michelle was ready for it all. She had the experience, the knowledge, and the quiet strength to handle whatever came her way. The team followed her lead, and under her guidance, the expansion began to take shape. Dave, meanwhile, had been relegated to a lesser role in the company. His reluctance to fully embrace Michelle's leadership had cost him dearly, and the board had made it clear that they saw Michelle as the future of the company. Dave had been left in the shadows, unable to regain the influence he had once enjoyed. Michelle didn't take pleasure in his downfall. It wasn't about revenge or proving him wrong. It was about the work, about doing what was right for the company, for the team, and for herself. But it was hard to ignore the satisfaction that came with knowing that the power had shifted in her favor. One evening, as Michelle was going over the final details of the expansion plan, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Tasha, her daughter. "How's the new project going, Mom? I'm so proud of you." Michelle smiled at the message, her heart swelling with pride. Tasha had always been her rock, the one who kept her grounded through the long hours and the tough times. She had seen Michelle struggle with self-doubt, with feeling invisible, but now, Michelle had proven to herself that she could rise above it all. "Thanks, sweetheart," Michelle typed back. "It's going great, and I couldn't have done it without you." As she put her phone down, Michelle leaned back in her chair, allowing herself a moment of quiet reflection. She had come a long way from the days when she felt like just another cog in the machine. She had fought for her place at the table, and now, she was leading the company into a new phase of growth. The quiet power she had once kept hidden was now her greatest strength. And as she looked out the window, watching the city lights flicker below, Michelle realized that she had finally stepped into the life she had always dreamed of. It wasn't about fame or accolades. It was about knowing her worth and owning it, about trusting herself and leading with quiet strength. She had taken the lead in a world that had once overlooked her, and now she was exactly where she was meant to be. The next few months passed in a blur of new challenges and victories. Michelle's leadership in the expansion project became the gold standard for the company, and the results were undeniable. Profits rose, the team was functioning more efficiently than ever, and the company's reputation in the industry was solidified. People were finally seeing Michelle for who she truly was, a force to be reckoned with, a leader in her own right. But as the project grew in scope, so did the attention on Michelle. With every win came a deeper understanding that she was no longer a background figure. She was at the forefront, and with that came both admiration and resentment. Dave, who had once been the face of the company's success, was now a forgotten name, lingering only in the corners of the office, a shadow of his former self. The dynamics between them had shifted irreparably. Dave's bitterness was almost palpable whenever he crossed paths with Michelle. He no longer tried to hide his resentment, and Michelle could sense the underlying hostility in every interaction. While Michelle thrived in her new role, Dave seemed to shrink into himself, retreating further from the limelight. His attempts to regain control were transparent, ineffective, and only served to highlight just how far behind he was. It was on one particular Tuesday afternoon when Michelle felt the full weight of this shift. The company was preparing for its quarterly review meeting with the board of directors. The air was thick with anticipation. Everyone had gathered to hear about the progress of the expansion and the continued success of Michelle's leadership. It was clear that the company's future was in her hands, and the board members were eager to hear what she had to say. Michelle had spent the morning preparing her presentation, ensuring that every slide was perfect, every number was accurate, and every narrative thread was clear. She had worked hard for this moment, not just for the praise, but to prove to herself that she had what it took to lead. As she walked into the boardroom, she could feel the eyes of the room on her. It wasn't just the usual polite acknowledgement. This time, there was genuine respect in the air. The room was filled with company executives, department heads, and a few external partners who had been closely following the project's progress. Dave was seated at the far end of the room, as usual, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. He was still here, still part of the company, but it was clear that he no longer had the influence he once did. Michelle stood at the front of the room, her laptop open, the projector casting a soft glow on the wall behind her. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the executives who had once underestimated her. They were no longer the ones she needed to convince. They were the ones who now looked to her for guidance. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady and confident. "Today, I'm here to present the results of our expansion efforts and share where we're heading next. I'm proud to say that we've not only met our original goals, but exceeded them in ways that will set the company up for long-term success." She began walking through the slides, outlining the key results and the milestones the company had achieved. The room was silent as she spoke, the executives hanging on her every word. Michelle felt the weight of their attention, but instead of nervousness, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was her moment, not just to prove her worth, but to show that she had always been capable of leading, even if no one had seen it before. As she continued through the presentation, Michelle glanced toward Dave. He was staring at the screen, his jaw clenched. It was subtle, but it was there, his quiet frustration, his inability to accept the fact that Michelle had become the face of the company's success. The longer the meeting went on, the more his resentment grew, until it was almost tangible in the room. She didn't let it affect her. She had worked too hard for this, and the results spoke for themselves. The board members were nodding in approval, asking questions about the next steps, and Michelle answered each one with confidence and clarity. For the first time, she didn't feel like she had to prove herself to anyone. She wasn't asking for their approval anymore. She had earned it. The meeting wrapped up with a round of applause from the board, and Michelle could feel the weight of their approval. They weren't just clapping for the success of the project. They were clapping for Michelle, for the leader who had taken the reins and turned the company around. She had done it, and as the meeting ended and people filed out of the room, Michelle could feel the shift that had taken place. She wasn't just part of the team anymore. She was the leader now, and nothing was going to change that. But as Michelle turned to leave the room, she caught sight of Dave. He had stood up, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his face flushed with anger. The look in his eyes was one of pure resentment, and it hit Michelle like a punch to the gut. "Michelle," he called out, his voice low and tight with frustration. "I don't know why you're getting all this credit. You didn't do it alone. I was the one who pushed this project forward. You just happened to be there when it succeeded." Michelle stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this moment was coming. She had known that eventually Dave would lash out. He couldn't stand to see her succeed. He couldn't stand to see the power shift away from him. "I didn't just happen to be there, Dave," Michelle said calmly, her voice steady. "I've been here all along, doing the work, making the decisions, guiding the team. You can't take credit for something you didn't fully lead." Dave opened his mouth to retort, but Michelle held up her hand, silencing him. "This project succeeded because the team believed in me, because I earned their trust. It succeeded because I led it." For a moment, the room was still. Dave's face was red with frustration, and Michelle could see the anger in his eyes. But she wasn't afraid of him anymore. She wasn't afraid of anyone. She had earned her place, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it from her. "I think we're done here," Michelle said softly, her voice firm. "I've done my job, Dave, and I've done it well." With that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Dave standing behind her, his jaw clenched, his pride shattered. She could feel his eyes on her, but she didn't turn around. She didn't need to. As Michelle walked down the hallway, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. This moment, this victory was hers. It had been earned through quiet determination, through the willingness to stand up for herself, and through the strength to lead when it mattered most. The company had finally seen her for who she was. The project was a success, and her leadership had been validated in ways she had never thought possible. But it wasn't just about the project. It was about the power shift that had happened within her. She had gone from the quiet support to the leader, and now there was no going back. As she stepped into her office, Michelle looked out the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. She had done it. She had taken control of her own future, and nothing, no one, could take that away from her. The days following the quarterly review felt like a quiet reverie, like the calm after a storm. Michelle had been flooded with recognition, her leadership now officially acknowledged by the company's upper echelons. Yet, despite all the accolades, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting within her. It wasn't a sense of complacency, but rather an understanding that the journey ahead was going to be a different one. One that didn't require constant proof of her worth. She had already done that. The project was moving forward. The expansion had reached its first major milestone, with the team already seeing early signs of success. Michelle spent her days overseeing the implementation of new strategies, tracking key performance indicators, and mentoring the younger members of the team who were eager to learn from her experience. Felt like everything was falling into place. And yet, there were moments, quiet moments, when Michelle found herself staring out of her office window, the bustling city of Chicago below her, and wondering, what comes next? What would it feel like to lead with a sense of peace instead of the constant pressure of proving herself? It was during one of these moments of contemplation that Michelle realized just how far she had come. She had spent years working tirelessly, never asking for anything more than the opportunity to do her job. She had been overlooked, underestimated, and pushed aside more times than she could count. But she had always kept moving forward, never allowing herself to be defined by the opinions of others. Now, as she gazed out at the city skyline, she understood that the work she had poured her heart and soul into, was the thing that mattered most. It wasn't about the accolades or the recognition. It was about the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she had accomplished what she set out to do. She had led the team, turned the project around, and secured the company's future. And she had done it on her own terms. The next morning, Michelle arrived at the office early, as she always did. The familiar hum of the building, the soft clink of coffee cups and the rustling of papers were comforting sounds now. But there was something different in the air today, something that felt like the beginning of the next phase. As she walked through the hallways, she was greeted by her team, each one offering a smile, a nod of respect. They had become more than just colleagues. They had become a part of her journey. She had always believed that leadership wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about building trust and earning respect. And that's exactly what she had done. Morning, Michelle. Elaine, the receptionist, called as Michelle passed by the front desk. Got some good news in the inbox today. Another approval for the next phase of the expansion. Michelle smiled and nodded. Great, Elaine. Let's keep this momentum going. She made her way into her office and sat down at her desk, the weight of the past few months settling gently on her shoulders. There was a calmness now, a sense of inner peace that hadn't been there before. She wasn't constantly scrambling for approval or validation. She didn't need it anymore. Her phone buzzed with a new email, and Michelle opened it to find a message from Linda, the CEO. Michelle, I've been thinking about how much you've accomplished in such a short time. I'd like to offer you a permanent leadership role in the new division we're expanding. You'll have a seat at the executive table and will be involved in major decision-making going forward. I have full confidence in your ability to lead us through this next phase. Let's talk more about this when you have a moment. Michelle sat back in her chair, her heart racing for a brief moment. It was official. She had done it. The recognition, the trust from Linda, it all confirmed what Michelle had known for some time now. She was the leader, but even as excitement surged within her, Michelle also felt a deep sense of calm wash over her. This wasn't a finish line. It was the beginning of something new. It was a new challenge, a new responsibility, and she was ready for it. That afternoon, Michelle made her way to the company's executive boardroom, where Linda had asked her to meet. As she entered the room, Linda stood up, a wide smile on her face. Michelle, thank you for coming in. I know you've been busy, but I wanted to have this conversation in person. Michelle smiled and took a seat. I'm happy to be here, Linda. I'm excited about the future. Linda's eyes sparkled with approval. I'm sure you are. The company is in a good place right now, but with your leadership, we're going to do even better. I've been watching you, Michelle. The way you handle yourself, the way you lead not just the team, but the entire company. I'm confident that with you at the helm, we're going to take the company to new heights. Michelle felt a rush of gratitude, but it wasn't the recognition she was seeking anymore. It was something deeper, something more personal. She had earned this position not because of her desire for recognition, but because of her commitment to doing the work, to leading with integrity, and to trusting herself. I'm grateful for the opportunity, Linda, Michelle said, her voice steady, and I'm ready to take on this new role. I won't let you down. Linda nodded, her expression softening. I know you won't. You've already proven yourself. Michelle leaned forward, her heart full of determination. I'm ready for the next challenge. Whatever comes next, I'm ready to face it head on. As the weeks passed, Michelle's role within the company continued to evolve. She took on more responsibility, made more decisions, and began shaping the company's direction in ways she had once only dreamed of. Her leadership style remained the same, quiet, thoughtful, and deliberate. She wasn't someone who sought attention, but rather someone who believed in building trust through consistent action. Despite the weight of the work, Michelle felt lighter now. She wasn't the person she had been when she first started. Someone who feared being overlooked, someone who worked tirelessly just to be seen. No, she had found her place. She had claimed her spot at the table, and she knew her worth. Her team continued to thrive under her leadership. The expansion was moving forward at a pace that exceeded everyone's expectations. But even as success came, Michelle was mindful of one thing. The quiet strength that had gotten her this far was still her guiding force. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone. The work was enough. Her leadership spoke for itself. One evening, after another long day of meetings and strategy sessions, Michelle found herself standing on the balcony of her apartment, looking out at the sprawling city below. The cool evening breeze ruffled her hair, and the glow of the city lights flickered in the distance. It was peaceful here, in this quiet moment, and Michelle allowed herself to just be still, to take in everything that had happened. She thought about her journey, about the days when she had felt invisible, about the struggles, the doubts, and the challenges. But she also thought about the victories, the moments when she had stepped up, when she had made her mark. She had done it on her own terms, without compromise, without sacrificing who she was. And now, as she stood there, feeling the weight of her accomplishments, she realized something profound. It wasn't just about the recognition or the title. It was about the transformation she had undergone. The work had always been the driving force, but the journey had reshaped her. It had taught her that leadership wasn't about forcing your way to the top. It was about earning it steadily and consistently, through quiet power, through actions that spoke louder than words. She had become the leader she had always wanted to be. And it hadn't come from external validation. It had come from the quiet determination to show up every day, to do the work, and to trust in herself. Michelle smiled softly to herself as she looked out over the city. There was still much to be done, many more challenges to face. But she was ready. She had already walked through the hardest part of the journey, the moment when she had to prove to herself that she was enough. Now, she was simply living the truth of who she had become.